grateful for Mimi's not speaking, because just last week in Nepal, I spoke first and she spoke second, and it was clear who was the best loved of the two. Let me open with a little Russian proverb, which will become clear perhaps as I speak a little more. A bird, a migratory bird, but it delayed its departure for the south too late, and the snows came and snowed on the bird, and the bird couldn't fly its wings south. One came up to the cow and said, "What's the matter?" He says, "Well, I can't get warm enough to flap my wings to fly south." And the kindly cow said, "Well, geez, you know, I'm just a cow. I don't know how I really can help, but I know that I can warm you up a bit because my poop is warm. So I could poop. You could climb into the poop, warm yourself up inside the poop, enough that you get the energy to fly away." So good plan. Cow poops right on the bird. Bird is huddled inside the warm cow poop, warming up, warming up, warming up. Just as the bird's ready to fly, along comes a wolf. He's a small bird, grabs it, wipes the poop off, eats it. Very Russian proverb, wouldn't you say? The moral of the proverb is, not everybody who shits on you is your enemy. Not everybody who takes you out of a pile of shit is your friend. I think the point of that will become clear. So the theme of the talk is the great betrayal. Youth are not equipped for their aspirations in spite of doing what they were told. Youth were told, go to school, stay in school, do your homework, you'll graduate, you'll get a good job, all will be well. And that's just not true, because the schooling they're getting isn't in fact adequately equipping them for the world. And this is a truly, truly massively not equipping them for the world. So this is one of the questions from ASER's recent Beyond Basics, which surveyed 14 to 18-year-old youth. They asked this question about calculating time. How many hours did this girl sleep? This isn't even an arithmetic problem. You can answer this counting off the fingers of your hand, which is how I would do it in spite of knowing calculus. I would like 12:30. And you can see that more education helped. So if you had less than 8 years, only about 27% got it right, 8 more years. But people with 8 or more years of schooling, only 42% got it right. And what's truly mind-blowingly shocking is of the students of this age that were enrolled in tertiary institutions, about half of them could answer this question. So there being aspiration for the kinds of jobs that they think are associated with being a college graduate, and they can't tell time. That is the paradox that we're headed into. So the main storyline of my talk is there's been this amazing, impressive transformational success in India and around the world in getting kids into school, number of grades completed. Schooling has been a triumph. But the premise of schooling was that you would learn capabilities, skills, and dispositions, and things that would equip you to be a successful adult. And that's just not happening. And what makes that even worse is that there is nothing harder to change than an organization that's had success. Because if you've been successful, even if the things that brought you the success are demonstrably not the things that you need to do the next stage, it is almost impossible to change a successful organization. And that is what has to happen in India and across the world. And I'm speaking mainly about India, but most of the features of India are generic across a range of countries. So there really is this demographic dynamite. This is the demographic pyramid of India. There is the demographic bulge is coming with more and more youth that are emerging from their youth into the labor market. This is inevitable. These people are alive. These people are coming. And if their aspirations continue to be thwarted, kaboom. Arab Spring, kaboom. What's happening in Chile, kaboom. Frustrated aspirations of educated youth are the most dangerous thing for political and social stability at all, and that's exactly what we're headed. So we're waking up, we're lighting a match and realizing, holy shit, we are sitting on a powder keg, and unless this powder keg gets addressed, it's going to go off. So, success and expansion. One doesn't want to undersell the success. It is a necessary, in some ways, condition for adequately equipping youth that they be in school. But that's been done. But the promise of schooling was based on the premise of learning. So if you think, here's the capabilities that you need, and these can be anything you want to talk about, hard, soft, 19th century, 21st century, you need some set of capabilities in order to adequately cope with the world and be a successful adult. And I mean that in the broadest possible sense of being a citizen of your state, being an adequate parent, being, productive in the labor force. This is not a narrow focus on human capital. This is just equipping yourself to be a successful adult. And the premise was, if we got through enough time served, and which is the primary metric that people are focused on, and you notice there's only two social phenomena measured in terms of time served. One is school. But the premise was, if you served your time, over time you would acquire capabilities, and if there's some minimal threshold of what you need to happen, the learning profile has to be steep enough that in the time you spend in school, you're equipped with the skills you need. But mostly, you're on the red line. Mostly, people who are getting a basic education are getting a basic schooling are not getting a basic education. Learning inside Indian schools is incredibly bad. And there's a learning crisis basically from the bottom to the top. So you've all seen, I'm sure, I hope, you've all seen the ASER numbers, so I'm not going to show you many more of the ASER numbers. But the ASER numbers are roughly consistent with everything else we see, and so I want to emphasize that there's no fluke in this. The Demographic and Health Survey interviews women around the world. It's added a question in which women are added to read a single, simple sentence like, farming is hard work. Like 4 or 5 words. This isn't reading a passage for comprehension. This is just, and it's in any language they choose. So it's not English, any language of their choice. And this is the learning profile of women who, adult women who this was their highest grade completed. This is the fraction that can read. And India is here, kind of paired with Bangladesh, better than Nigeria, but 40 percentage points behind Indonesia. And I'm using Indonesia partly because I lived there too and love it. I love India, but I love Indonesia too. Partly because it's kind of a middle tier competitor, and partly because I have other evidence about Indonesia that is really, really awful. And just keep in mind that everything I show you about Indonesia, it's likely to be much better than what it is in India. The recent World Bank came out with a human capital index that tried to be a kind of generic, what's all the data, let's put it all in a bucket and make it comparable. And again, everybody can hate the World Bank. I worked there for a long time, don't mind if you hate it. But they're doing the best they can. I wouldn't take this like as deep true religion, but I wouldn't take it as nothing either. But this is the neighborhood India is in. Here's the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here's Ethiopia. Here's Afghanistan. Here's Gambia. They're about as far ahead of Yemen, which is the lowest country in the world, as they are behind Indonesia. And they're about 170 points behind Vietnam, who is not a super rich country, but education outperformer. And relative to the leaders in the world, they're 200 points on this scale behind. And 200 points basically means these distributions don't overlap. The best students in India are going to be behind the worst students in these other countries. So And I just want to be clear that even though India produces some at the tail, upper tail, some of the most impressive people in the world, including all of you in this room can assume you're exempt from all of this and assume you're the most impressive people in the world. But statistically speaking, if we say how many could read at PISA, PISA is a common assessment used around the world, 4, 5, and 6 is roughly the OECD 30th percentile. OECD 30th percentile is somebody who kind of could go to college. Right? An OECD student at the 30th percentile is not like super genius being recruited to go to college, but they're probably going to show up in college. About a third of students in the UK and about 40% of students in South Korea are in those categories. Less than 1% of the assessed students in the 2009 PISA are in those categories. So paradoxically, there's too little inequality in India. Why? Because if the mean is low, you want some people out in the tail, there has to be more inequality, not less inequality. So India's problem is not inequality. India's problem is low average and about average inequality, which means the top doesn't do very well either. So there are 4 strategies that are popular and are almost certainly going to be tried and almost certainly will fail. But they're going to take up everybody's time. They're going to be, implemented in part because these are just these are ways of coping with the learning crisis that really doesn't require you to tackle the real problem. So the first is kind of, it can't be that bad. Look, we're growing at 5% or 6% or whatever the government's lying to you that's saying they're growing at now. It's not 6, believe me. Anyway, but oh well, it can't be that bad because look, our economy is growing really rapidly. So we'll just wait and see. This growth will take care of everything. Well, turns out this is the scatter plot between level of schooling and GDP per capita, and the relationship just isn't that good. So if you said, how much would we improve by just moving along the normal trajectory with respect to growth? Turns out if India grows for 20 years at 5% per capita, the natural expectation of this cross-sectional association is it gained 30 points. It's not nothing, but that means you go from, on the World Bank scale, 355 to 385. So 20 years of super rapid growth would get you 20 points behind Indonesia. It would get you 140 points behind Vietnam. You're still way, 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 way behind on any educational thing. So wait and see is just not a good strategy. And just because you're doing well on other fronts is not necessarily going to translate into success. The second strategy is more schooling. And I want to talk a little bit more about this than I normally would, because I've just finished a paper and I'm showing you results that we haven't shown anybody before. And they're just incredibly shockingly, they're incredibly shocking. Now, the problem with more schooling, because after all, more schooling makes some sense. It's like, well, if we're not, if we're not to where we want to be by this level, let's just keep kids in school longer till they get there, right? The problem is there's increasingly good evidence that these learning profiles that I've just drawn as linear aren't linear. These learning profiles taper off. And you stop learning when you're being exposed to the standard instruction, which means if they taper off, pushing more kids through schooling is pushing them along not a shallow profile, but a flat profile, and isn't going to produce any gain in their learning at all. So now this is data from Indonesia, and they have a high quality panel survey that tracked specific individuals and households over time, and they looked at the difference between levels of schooling of a cohort and their ability to do some simple arithmetic. And there were 8 arithmetic questions aggregated into an index. And this is simple arithmetic. This is like 1/3 minus 1/6 equals in a multiple choice, right? So I'm hoping none of this audience has to stop and think hard about 1/3 minus 1/6, right? So here is what happened, which is over those 2 periods, about 20 percentage points more of the students finished senior secondary. So they have almost 60% of students now going through all 12 years of schooling. But these lines are the likelihood that with these levels of schooling, you get a typical arithmetic question correct, which goes from about, and the blue line is 2014, no, the blue line is 2000, the red line is 2014. You can see the problem, which is going from almost no schooling to senior secondary only increases your chance of answering the question by about 20 percentage points. And I'm going to use this phrase several times in this talk, but wait, it's actually much worse than that. That might look really terrible, but here is what the learning profile of the currently enrolled looks like with respect to propensity to answer those questions, which means you actually get better in the early grades and then stop. So basically from the time you hit 6th grade till you hit 11th grade, and 12th grade is some kind of anomaly because they're holding kids back so that they don't, and by the way, this is more than 12, so this includes all secondary. So, but just focus on 6 to 12. From 6 to 12, your ability to answer 1/3 minus 6 doesn't go up at all. And it's not because it hit a particularly high level. This is 20% likelihood to answer the question correctly, adjusted for guessing, right? Multiple choice. So this is evidence that all of this additional schooling didn't increase cohort ability to cope with arithmetic at all. So what happened was, if you actually assessed what's the likelihood a typical 18 to 24-year-old, the youth cohort in 2000 could answer the question, it was 35% correct. In 2004, it had fallen 0.5%. 1 in 5 more kids was finishing senior secondary, and the cohort ability to answer arithmetic went down. I'm letting that sink in, because that means all of the effort of pushing all of those kids through school didn't equip them, at least on this one skill set, with anything with respect to this particular skill. And part of it was that the profile got worse over time, meaning kids were learning less at each level, so your likelihood of getting it correct. But part of it was just flat. Even had you maintained the same profile, it would have only gone up by 5% because it's just flat. You're not learning anything. So now let's come back to India and think, okay, what's going to happen if we, push schooling from 8 years to 10 years to 12 years? Well, we've just, as part of this RISE research project I'm part of, Kartik Mullaradharan has been working on a evaluation of computerized instruction. Now, the coolest thing for me about the computerized instruction is that before it launches into the interactive instruction with the student, it assesses their level of ability. And this is the level of ability in math of kids in these grades. And this line is the curriculum. So in 8th grade, and each dot represents 10 students, so of all of the students in 8th grade in Rajasthan, there were 20 actually at the curricular level. Nobody actually above it, but 20 at the curricular level. And the mean was 4th grade, and about 40% of the kids were at 3rd or 2nd grade level. Okay, so you're teaching an 8th grade class. In this 8th grade class, what do? Well, if you teach the 8th grade curriculum, there's only so much range that a given set of instruction can cover, right? Meaning I'm giving this level of a talk. I could give a much more technical talk, but I would lose part of the audience. I could give a much more basic talk, but I would bore much of the audience. So try to tailor it to the level of technical skill of the audience, because I know that some people are going to not learn a lot in this talk because they already know a lot, but some people aren't going to learn a lot because they can't even understand the graphs and figures I'm showing, but I've pitched it. So if you pitch the curriculum to roughly, if you pitch the teaching to the curriculum and have this range, meaning I've centered my teaching here, these guys learn something, these guys learn something, but people below this don't learn anything, then all of these kids are going to learn nothing. And conversely, if I decide, holy smoly, I got to remediate, well, and I pitch it here, then all of these kids are going to learn nothing. There's just no way around this, right? There's only so much, you know, if choose your favorite god descended from the heavens and had to teach this class, they would be forced with the same conundrum, right? I've got to pitch it somewhere. And that is, in fact, what we see if you look at what in this experimental setup, the bottom third of the class by initial ability, when tested at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, learned nothing. The top, and we're looking at the red because that's the control group where nothing happened. And even in the non-computerized instruction, the control group at the top of the third continued to learn. What that means is, it didn't matter whether the bottom third dropped out or not in terms of their assessed learning. It could have dropped out, could have not dropped out. Either way, given the pace at which the instruction was pitched. So if you look at it, what's happening in a typical kind of poor country, and this graph is geared to kind of replicate what happened in a set of 6 lower income countries that took a modified version of the PISA. Kind of what happened is only a third of the kids were actually still in school to take the PISA assessment. Their range of scores was roughly here, where this, by the way, is 500. This is 400. 400 is commonly considered the lowest level. The PISA reports say 400 is the minimally adequate level of learning, adequately equipping somebody to participate in the modern world. Below this, you have not been equipped for any sort of aspirations in the modern world. And you see the typical country is barely getting a few people above that line of the tested. And then the rest drop out at various stages. And the question is, what would their learning have been had they stayed in school? And when we build a semi-complicated simulation model that takes into account reasonable parameterizations of the learning process, that takes into account that it has a fixed width, not everybody in the classroom is learning the same, and some kids are going to learn nothing if they're too far behind. We generate a set of learning profiles like these, where the least able students, their learning profiles flatten. But if you assume that who drops out are the least able students, then this is the distribution of scores within by moving. And this is like, I don't mean to say this is dramatic, but this is dramatic. Like if you go from 30% of kids in school at 15 to 100%, you've put 7 out of 10 more kids in your country through grade 10. Some of them dropped out to 2, 4, 8, whatever. Everybody gets to grade 10. This is the distribution of scores before and after. So blue is at the observed grade attainment. Red is with universal attainment. Guess what happens? Nobody additional is over 400. Nobody additional is over 300. Nobody additional is over 200. Why? Because everybody who was learning was staying in school, and the kids who weren't learning were out of school. So pushing kids that weren't learning back into school has zero impact. So all of the drama of achieving universal secondary school completion, by our estimates, gives you zero progress on the SDG goal of minimum adequacy, which is set at 400. And it really gives you, and the only gain is that a few kids at the very bottom learn a bit more before their learning profiles turns flat anyway. So, and I'm saying this because all of what everybody is going to want to do is what they know how to do, which is put kids in school and keep them there. And if in fact the learning profile was steep, I would be radically in favor of that. But at the current way in which classes are taught in India, I suspect that is going to be completely and totally Pyrrhic. And Pyrrhic is related to pyre, and pyre is a big fire, because you're going to put a bunch of kids through school telling them, keep doing this and your life will be better, and you're not going to teach them anything, and they are going to be pissed. The third thing the government's going to continue to do is it's going to continue to do things like SSA. And the way I characterize things like SSA is they're going to continue to fund what I call thin inputs. A thin input is the kind of thing that's easy to measure, it's objective, I can quantify it, the government can procure it, the government can measure it, you can put it on the dashboard, the chief minister can look at his dashboard and feel good about whatever the hell is going on, but has nothing to actually do with real results. So in the period of SSA, and this is the government's own data, they in fact were enormously successful at pushing the SSA thin input targets. They got to, you know, every school had drinking water, the number of schools with a gross toilet tripled, class size plummeted, in part because the government schools lost 1.3 million students. So during the period in which SSA was supposedly improving public schools, 1.3 million kids less were in school, in part because 900,000 had voted with their feet out of the public sector into the private sector. And there's no evidence from the learning assessments learning was getting any better inside the school. So again, this is what they're going to do because they know how to do it. They know how to build a girls' toilet. And if any, so what are they going to do? I don't know. Girls' toilet. We can do that, right? School learning results are disastrous, but you know, cleaner place to pee. I'm all in favor of that. But let's not kid ourselves about what the net result for learning is going to be. So, and you know, this is an old graph which I keep looking to update but never do. This is just the standard ASER data showing that successive cohorts are just on lower and lower learning trajectories. I think it's picked up a little bit in the more recent assessments, but it's not getting better in spite of, again, all of the attention and the additional expenditure, per pupil expenditure by the federal government went up 11-fold. I think it tripled overall. Just didn't help. But wait, it's worse than that. I told you I was going to use that phrase again, right? Which is, it's worse than that because all the talk in the world is about the future of jobs. What's the problem with the future of jobs? The future of jobs is the workforce is inadequately skilled for the jobs of the future. But now we're talking about India. We're talking about the Netherlands. So this is the distribution of PISA levels of the Netherlands. The Netherlands is scared to death that students at these levels of learning aren't adequately equipped for the future. So the whole global discourse on the future of jobs is worried that people at PISA 3 and 4 are not adequately equipped for the future, much less people at level 2. And what the hell are we going to do about it? But a country like Guatemala, there isn't anybody there anyway. Their problem with the future of jobs is not what do we do with all the level 3 and 4 kind of middle-class, blue-collar jobs that aren't going to exist anymore. Their problem is they don't have anybody at level 3 and 4. So the problem is the capabilities that we think you need to actually adequately cope with the 21st century keep going up and up. And the learning profiles keep getting flatter and flatter and falling and falling. So whatever the problems we had 10 years ago and today, if the basic schooling is inadequate to create adequate skills to cope with today's Indian economy, imagine if it continues to stagnate or deteriorate, how well equipped it will be to cope with the economy of 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And the crazy thing about the world is there's lots of things about the world we can't predict, but we can exactly predict what a 50-year-old 40 years from now learning at age 10 is. Why? Getting it today. People who will be 50, 40 years from now or 10 today, we know exactly what they're learning at age 10. The future is being determined now of what the basic foundational skills were of the labor force far into the future. And in this talk about coping with the skills of the future, everybody, wow. We clearly need to ramp up tertiary education. We need to focus on, getting more kids into college. Problem is, flat learning profile. This is a study, and this is the only study I've seen like it. Oh no, crap, I just misspelled proficiency. Misspelling words in a presentation on education. Bad idea. Okay. I'll hold my finger over there for a second. So this is an assessment of adult proficiency in literacy, in which they tested adults, not children, adult literacy skills. And what we see is this is just the city of Jakarta, so probably the most best educated, best elite, highest performing place in Indonesia. The people with a tertiary degree in Indonesia were well behind high school dropouts in Japan. So if you think, and again, remember Indonesia's 40 percentage points ahead of India. If you think putting more kids in tertiary school is going to equip them for the skills of the future, kaboom! You're going to have a whole bunch of people who not only suffered through grade 10 and SAT exams, not only suffered through 2 more years of that SAT, another set of exams, and then got an undergraduate degree, and it turns out, kaboom! They're not actually adequately equipped to do anything in the world. Okay. Now it gets crazy. How am I doing on time? You there? Enjoying yourself? Okay. Okay. I'm fine. So now the presentation been pretty bad so far, right? Now it's going to take a weird kind of turn, because you might think I'm going to tell you how to fix it. And you know what? I could, but I'm not going to. And the reason I'm not going to is nobody's listening. Because they're going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to waste another 10 or 15 years, and there's going to be another cohort of youth get their life chances pissed away by exactly the same system we have today. And it doesn't matter if I tell you how to fix it, it's not going to happen. So let me talk more about why it's not going to happen. The reason it's not going to happen, And then we'll come back. The reason it's not going to happen is that it's really hard to change organizations, particularly those that have had success. So, and just this is across the board. This isn't the government, it's all organizations, right? So the Catholic Church was really successful for 1,500 years. It dominated the religious life of an entire swath of Europe. And then this one guy, roughly, Martin Luther. Like, how big a problem can Martin Luther be, really? Like, he's one guy, like typing away some stuff and pinning it to the door of his church, right? Catholic Church had been successful in maintaining, lost all of Northern Europe forever because it couldn't adequately reform itself to cope with some criticisms of friggin' Martin Luther, right? So, hard for the Catholic Church to change, even when the entire future of the religious affiliation of entire countries was on the line. They just couldn't bring themselves to do it. And they had this evolved over 50 years. It wasn't like this happened overnight. I'm an American, American military. You can hate it. You probably should hate it for what it does, but it's amazingly effective. But the American military got their asses completely kicked in Vietnam. Why? Because they were really successful at preparing to fight a tank battle in Eastern Europe. If you had tried to fight them in a tank battle in Eastern Europe, they would have won. But they had to fight a war in a jungle against an insurgency in Southeast Asia. Amazing, effective organization full of really capable leadership got their ass kicked. And they didn't get their ass kicked quickly. They got their ass kicked year after year after year, and they knew what they needed to do to not get their ass kicked, and they couldn't do it because they were so successful. They had been successful in the past. And so changing what had brought the success in the past in order to win today, even when it's existential, doesn't happen. I could give example after example, and this is true of the private sector. This isn't just a government thing or a nonprofit thing. If you would have gone to business school at any place in the world in the 1970s, you would have learned about Sears. Sears was a monolith. Sears dominated retailing. And you know what the secret to Sears was? Mail order. You know what the richest man in the world does? Mail order. Why doesn't Sears dominate? Why is there an Amazon? Because Sears had to change the way it did its practices in order to cope with a fundamental change in the market faced with. Everybody in Sears knew it. Everybody in Sears knew how they had to change, and they couldn't do it. Why? Because they had been so successful, and the habits, approaches, practices ingrained in their success were impossible to ungroove, even when everybody knew it was existential. I mean, Sears has gone out of business. I mean, Sears is gone. It's bankrupt from being the dominant thing. So I want to talk, just for my remainder of the time I'm going to talk, about three big concepts that I think are relevant to how one would go about. This isn't how to fix the Indian education sector, basic education in particular, but tertiary is increasingly a huge problem too. But there's three concepts. One is bringing organizations back from the brink is an entirely different problem than managing an organization to get better. Okay? So, and it's harder. So any functional organization, I would argue, has three things. The organization has a clear, coherent, well-understood purpose. They have a one-sentence description of what they do that they can tell to anybody. Doesn't involve a bullshit mission statement with a lot of modifiers. It's simple. You know what the mission statement of the Air Force is? U.S. Air Force? Fly, fight, win. And if you ask yourself, I'm in the Air Force, what should I be doing? You should be preparing the organization to fly, fight, win. You have all understood everything you need to understand in order for the U.S. Air Force to be effective, right? Second, it has a USP of the organization or of the organization's unit. And USP is an Indian term that was very popular when I was here. It's probably out of fashion, but a unique selling point. Like, what is it that makes this organization unique in terms of its contribution to purpose? Right? And again, you should be able to have a one sentence. There's lots of people doing this, but of those, we're unique because. If you can't answer that question, very hard to sustain a successful organization. And third, each individual in that organization should understand how they're making a contribution to the purpose and to the USP. You have those three things. This is what I would call the core of an organization. And then everything else is support, right? HR just hires people into this core. That's their job. Legal makes sure the core doesn't end up being destroyed by inadvertent legal mistakes. Procurement, public financial management just acquires things for the core to use. But these are just services. What happens often when an organization dies is it loses one of the three things its core, and then it gets eaten alive by its service functions. And if anybody in the room over 40 has worked in an organization like this, in which all that you do is follow the rules. Everybody's lost. What is the organization for? But here's how we hire people via HR. What is the organization for? Here's how we can do procurement, right? And so this becomes a zombie in which the support functions feed off the carcass of purpose, right? Why am I going here? Because once you've lost the core, strengthening this is bullshit. And everybody's thinking, why does he need to say that? Because this is what dashboards do. Dashboards create a whole bunch of data and information that are generated, right? If you have a core, you can use a dashboard. But you can easily have a dashboard feeding off a lost, there's no technical core. People don't understand what their contribution is. People don't understand what the USP is. People don't understand what the purpose is, but they know what the rules are and they can follow the rules. And by the way, if you insist that they meet numerical targets, they can show you data that meets those numerical targets, right? And so the capability of the organization is not here. State capability is not the capability to enforce rules. State capability is the ability of organizations to have purpose, USP, and recognize and reward and have individuals understand their contribution. And the education system of India will not be revived with dashboards. It will be revived by reviving a core that understands purpose, that understands how the schooling they're in can the purpose, and where every individual understands their own contribution to USP and stuff. And this is just, I'm contractually obligated to show you a picture of an animal. Students wouldn't forgive me if I didn't have some animal pictures. And because the fundamental point is you can't beat a turtle to move. So any of you who worked in and around the Indian state would love to beat it with a stick, right? It would be so fun. It's so recalcitrant. It's so obnoxious. It's so difficult. Wouldn't it be fun to beat the state with a stick? The problem is if you beat a turtle with a stick, its arms pull in, its head pulls in, it sits there, you get tired. It has survived in the dysfunction that it has because it's impervious to external attack. If you're not cooperating with the inside of the turtle, you're not moving the turtle. Okay. I say this because beating the turtle type initiatives that we're going to drive this organization to performance, God damn it, by, you know, monitoring their every action, and we're going to inject a chip into their butt so that we can follow where they are every minute of the day. Not going to work. Because ultimately, to produce high quality work, people have to believe in it. People have to understand it. Okay. Second major concept. Which is really easy to understand if you understand phase dynamics. Almost no one does, including me. But the fundamental thing is there's practices, what people actually do, and there's policies that are written on paper. The easy illusion for educated people like us to imagine is that what we do best with the right words on paper is what matters most. Right? It'd be really cool if the policies that we sat around and concocted really mattered, and that we could make huge jumps. We could jump from our existing practices and policies towards best practice policy, and that jump towards best practice policy would create dynamics in the policy practice space that would put a lot of pressure on practices to improve towards the level of practices consistent with the policy. So you know what we'll do? We'll adopt a best practice environmental law. We'll adopt a best practice transparency law. We'll adopt a best practice education law. We'll adopt the same curriculum as Finland, right? Why? Because there's a belief that policy can go very fast and practice will follow. And I just don't think that that's true. I think that it's easy to create a dynamics in the phase space in which there's a narrow corridor. Policy creates pressure on practices up to a point, but if policy gets far out of line with existing practice, it stops having any positive pressure on practice. So I'm going to illustrate this in a simple pedagogical technique of demonstrating phase dynamics. Like if I want my left hand to move, I can put a rubber band and drag my right hand, and that creates pressure on my right hand to move towards the left hand. Unless, and of course, everyone anticipates what's going to happen, I move it too far. Once policy is out here, policy can sing and dance and wave and do whatever the hell it wants, and it's having nothing to do with what's happening in practice, right? And so you can say, oh, policy is so cool. But it's completely disassociated from the ongoing practices and implementation. And that has happened again and again and again around the world. So you look at my score, I look at Finland, I say, gee, I want to be Finland, so let's adopt Finnish policies, and you're finished. You're finished because your policies are so out of whack with your existing practices, you've reduced rather than increased pressure on individuals to drive through practices, and kind of what really is going to drive good policies is when those policies are the realization of good practices. So you drive in the practice space to get better, and then you can consolidate that into policy so that it becomes the policy. But by the time it's the policy, it has to be the practice of most individuals to stick. Okay? Third big concept. So I've got two big concepts. One is you can't revive a zombie from the outside. Second big concept is big jumps in policy rather than hard slog in practice are unlikely to be successful in changing the status quo on a consistent, sustained basis. And the third is disruption. Now, disruption is this, what I mean by disruption is what Clay Christensen meant by disruption when he invented the term 20 years or so ago. Now everybody just uses disruption to mean cool. Oh, that's disruptive. So I'm going to talk about what the concept originally meant and what that means. So what the concept originally meant is there's tiers of the market. Here's what the low end will pay, here's what the mainstream will pay, here's what the high end will pay for product performance. And when this is in fact the best that can be done with technologies that exist in the world. This is what the best firms in the world can do. When what the best firms in the world can do is well below what the middle and top of the market want, the way to be a successful firm is to be the best at being the best. And this is what he calls sustaining technology, is you're moving ahead fastest. So who becomes the winner in this market and becomes the incumbent and remains as the incumbent pursues the sustaining strategy. Clay Christensen's claim is there is almost no firm in the world who has gained the incumbent dominance who has lost it to somebody that competed head-to-head. No one attacks incumbents head-to-head by being the best. Because once they've established themselves at being the best, they stay the best. And this is why, places like University of Chicago are still famous. Right? They got to be the best. And once you get to be the best, it's kind of relatively easy to stay the best. And it's really hard to attack Chicago head-to-head. But eventually, these guys, the best, get so expensive relative to what most people need that people realize there's a strategy of not being the best, but being tailored to the actual needs of the market. But it's inferior. It's a worse product than the best product in the world, but it meets the needs of the tier of the market. And that is what, technically speaking, Clay Christensen called a disruptive trajectory, which is I'm going to come in with lower product performance, but be on a dynamic improvement path. And eventually what happens is this firm never gets beaten at being the best, but they go bankrupt because they lose all of the market to the disruptor. Okay. Now, and that has become a quite popular kind of concept that lots of people have adopted in thinking through their strategy. Now, what's the difficulty with implementing a disruptive strategy, particularly with respect to the public sector? The problem is the public sector can remain and retain its market budget share without ever having to meet actual consumer demand, which means they can exist in a world in which they believe, in terms of product quality, they're the yellow line. And they believe that all they need is to do some reforms and they can become the green line. So educators around the world are pursuing sustaining innovation strategies to mimic and try and become the leading educators in the world. So they're Finland, right? Which is this, I've been to Finland many times. How bizarre Finland is. In the middle of Helsinki, there's a little port. In the middle of the port, there's a little market. In the market, there's a big Ferris wheel. One of the cars on the Ferris wheel is a sauna. So you can have a sauna Ferris wheel ride. That's just a weird place, right? And it's like 6 million super rich white people. You know how many visits they get a year from visiting education systems? They had to limit it to 180. 180 people a year are visiting Finland to learn the secrets of their success, because they're all under the complete and total delusion that they're here and all they need to do is get there. Whereas the reality is they're the red line. But they can be in consistent denial that they're the red line, not do what it takes to fix the red line because they pretend they're the yellow line. And they pretend we're adopting reforms in order to go from being the yellow line to being the green line. And it just is not going to work because you're not the yellow line. And as long as you pretend you're the yellow line and you're adopting reforms, most education plans are mapped from a place where you're not to a place you're never going to be. So here's a sophisticated, technologically slick, evidence-based view reference map of Frodo's trip to Mordor. That's what you're going to get from consultants. Consultants are going to give you a super slick PowerPoint presentation of how to get to Mordor from the Shire. But you're not in the goddamn Shire. There is no Shire. And there is no Mordor either. So, the difficulty with disruption, though, is that when people go to do disruptive things, like simplify their curriculum, like focus the curriculum so we achieve early learning in early grades, by changing the teaching methods to be much more basic and conceptual, relative to Finland, it looks worse. Relative to Finland, it is worse. Relative to the reality of an Indian government school, it's fantastically better, but they can persist and live in denial in a way that Sears couldn't, in a way that the US military couldn't, in a way that the Catholic Church couldn't. So you can persist in believing you're the yellow line and all you need to do is adopt some reform to get to the green line, whereas what you really need to do is get into this disruptive space on a dynamic path to make it better, and then India can create India's own future of success. So let me conclude there. Schooling succeeded with organizations that were coherent around the compliance logistics of expanding schooling. That was the key to their success, was compliance logistics. Meaning we're going to do what we're told, roughly as we're told to do it, we're going to report on it, and we're going to get it done. Basic learning is dismally bad. Organizations are trying to have success at learning with the same strategy that they had success in building out the system, and it's not going to work. It is going to continue to fail as it has been failing. It won't work, but like pessimism is, it won't stop people from doing it because it's what they know how to do. And you have to bring organizations back from the brink. To bring them back from the brink, you have to re-equip them with purpose. You have to engage them with hard slog and practice, not gold-plated policy. And you have to bring disruption where you're willing to do what's worse because you can't do what's best. Thank you very much.